Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Axel Threlfall, Editor-at-Large for Reuters, and our distinguished panel.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is the gig economy session. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with the context, but let me sum it up very, very quickly for you. Traditional employment models and a social compact we've all grown accustomed to under threat as technology gives rise to new models and new ways of working. The gig economy. Put simply, people using apps or platforms to sell their labor, I think is a pretty accurate way of putting it. It sparked, as we all know, heated debate over workers' rights and protections. For advocates, it's all about flexibility, autonomy, new opportunity. For opponents, it's about exploitation, lower pay, increased hours, decreased well-being, etc. Everyone's got something to say about it. The Archbishop of Canterbury came out recently and called the gig economy evil. And policymakers, as we well know, making lots of noise about it. Anyway, we've got a great panel for you. You've got half an hour, so let me get to them. Next to me is Kristin Sharp, who directs New America's initiative on work, workers, and technology, having co-founded Shift. Amit Singh is head of Future of Work Policy at Uber. And on the end is Vikrum Aiyer, Vice President of Global Public Policy and Strategic Comms at Postmates, which is an on-demand delivery platform, right, Vikram? Okay, good. Right, I want to start with you. Are we anywhere near reaching some sort of compromise between employers and workers on this?
It's a great question, and I would actually add another variable. It's the ecosystem of what it means to redefine how work and benefits derived from work and the delivery of those benefits is actually informed not just by the employers and the workers and their voice and their choice, but also worker voice organizations, lawmakers, certainly academic institutions. And I think that right now, something that's very different today than maybe just even a short few years ago is that companies, industry of all stripes are starting to pay attention to the need to lean into this conversation more and more. I would say that Postmates, for those that may be familiar, is a startup that can ostensibly just bring a burrito to your doorstep if you're hungover on a Sunday morning. But the fact is that now when we have a workforce of about 200,000 independent contractors, Postmates themselves, we're trying to figure out how to have this discussion.
Okay, who needs to work harder? Which side needs to work harder right now on this compromise?
From my perspective, I think that bipartisanship should not just be defined as Republican and Democrat in this country. It should be defined as industry and labor. Right now, worker voice organizations, unions, have very much felt that full-time employment is the bedrock of economic certainty. It's what grew the middle class in this country, and they are correct. But there are workforce trends that require us to have a new social compact that keeps up. I think that industry can really benefit by sharing its insights of how people are working, the habits that are being created through work forms like Postmates or Uber, and that conversation is really what's going to give elected officials and policymakers the top cover to sort of decouple these labor laws and benefit models.
All right, Kristin, let me bring you in, because I wonder if we're actually asking the right question here, and Amit and I were talking about this beforehand. Do people really want one or the other, flexibility or security? Or I imagine they want both, right?
Yes, I think they do want both. And I think that historically, we've leaned more towards economic stability, particularly in the traditional form of a job, than we have to flexibility. I mean, in our traditional conception of a job, you go to a specific place from 9 to 5 with a specifically defined set of responsibilities, and you do those things until the job doesn't continue for one reason or another because you quit or get fired.
Right.
And we're moving to a world in which everybody will be required, even people in traditional jobs, I think, to be a little bit more creative and self-motivated in trying to connect with new sources of income, trying to sort of find new skills, demonstrate why they continue to be relevant, and grow their abilities in that way. And you know, the ability to do that flexibly and to identify the kinds of skills that you want to grow and do that is something that's enabled through the gig economy. But you're right, like people say when you ask them in focus groups and surveys and everything else that the number one thing that they want out of work is economic stability.
Right.
So.
Maybe a bit unfair to throw this one straight at you, but why can't Uber give them both security and flexibility? Or is Uber giving them both?
So I think that's a really important question. Right? I think the best way to sort of start this debate, or at least to think about this debate, is that there's a misperception that people are trying to disrupt the social contract. Right? I think the better way to think about it is to modernize the social contract. Right? What we are solving for when we think about the social contract and we think about the benefits and dignity of work remains true today as it did 200 years ago. Right? How we solve for that has actually something that we've got to change. Right? And so what does that modernization mean? It means moving away from the sense of the binaries that we have about how we've defined work, the binaries between one particular classification and another. It's also moving away from the binaries about how we think about flexibility and stability. You can have flexibility and deliver stability. You can have stability, and then those that want stability in traditional employment, which will continue to predominate, will also want a degree of flexibility, right? So the reasons you can't is because we have grown up in a structure that actually reinforces and entrenches this binary. Yep. And to be honest, the binary is actually killing all of us. It's actually making it harder for everybody to be able to solve for these problems.
Okay, so this institutional structure is not allowing us to have both. Whose responsibility do you think it is to reformat that structure, to make sure we can do both?
I think it's everybody's responsibility, right? I think it's everybody's responsibility, and I actually think, and this might not help saying this in America, but actually across the Atlantic, there's been much more progress on this front, right? And I think what that has been is this shared responsibility, a shared responsibility between governments, between labor groups, between businesses. And I think the leadership of President Macron on this front has been very, very clear, right? I think the government in France has led on reforms, including proposals about the social charter. Businesses like ours have led by proposing packages like the partner protection package that includes not just workplace injury insurance and a whole range of other things, but also new types of insurance or new types of proposals that actually protect you from life events. So now if you're an Uber driver in France and in the rest of Europe, you get a payment if you have a child, if you fall sick, right? So I think it's a responsibility of everyone to edge towards innovation on this front.
Go ahead.
One thing that I think is really important in this conversation, it may sound obvious, is that when you read in the headlines what the gig economy is or is not offering workers in this modern day, sometimes there are assumptions being made by policymakers about what types of benefits and what types of economic stability and certainty people are owed or deserved. At the same time, there are statements that are made by companies like our own that claim like flexibility is a prima facie level of importance. Regardless of whether you believe in either one of those binary views, the worker's voice needs to be paramount in this conversation.
Right.
And to that, a benefit set for someone who's a 45-year-old driver who's just a recent parent may want to invest on what paid time off looks like or maternity and paternity leave, whereas an 18 to 34-year-old millennial delivering for Postmates may be far more interested in savings or maybe in access to college credits or anything that can help them pay the bills for schooling. And I think that needs to be part of the conversation.
I mean, again, apologies for putting the question like this, but are the Macrons of the world listening to the workers more than the U.S. administration and policy here in the U.S. is?
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe they're.
What can you learn here in the U.S. from France?
I think in the U.S. we have a tendency to reduce the concept of economic stability to just the question of benefits. And economic stability is a wider question than that. Economic stability has to do with how to advocate for workers so that they feel like, one, they have adaptability to different circumstances. Two, they can, sort of future forward plan in different ways. And three, there's resilience in the face of something unexpected. And getting those things, benefits is one piece of that, but it isn't the only piece of that. And thinking about it in a broader context of how you increase sources of income generation, how you have skills so that people feel confident in being able to generate income for themselves in a wide variety of circumstances. I think that's what we're going for. And we're just at a point where we're experimenting with different systems for that. In the private sector, within government, within cities, we see the whole network needing to work together.
I mean, come on in. Do you feel you're being listened to? I mean, you've got this critical role in Uber. that is that point person? Are you being listened to?
I think there is a tremendous amount of goodwill to try and solve this problem, right? And let's be clear. The issues that we're dealing with are endemically difficult, and they are filled with a level of politics that is justified, right? Like what we're talking about is the welfare of individuals, right? I think the thing that is a helpful sort of construct is actually to start at first principles. What are we solving for? Are we solving for the needs of working people? And what are those needs and how do they vary? And I think the thing that's really important is that what they need are different things in different scenarios, but there isn't a black and white sort of, 0 or 1. Someone wants 100% flexibility or someone wants 100% stability. I think that starting from the first principle of like, what are we actually solving for is a really important thing. I think the other thing is also making sure that we match aspiration with foundational commitments. I think to take Kristin's point, right? It's not just being able to say that you think that you want to make progress in this front. It's being able to actually match it with some sort of foundational commitments and investing that and experimenting that in different markets. And the last thing I'd like to say is one thing that would be really powerful is using these platforms as ways in which we can solve larger problems that have plagued work in general. We have a feature in our platform called Instant Pay. It actually allows you to get paid as soon as you work, right? That's like waiting 2 weeks to get paid is an actual problem that all workers have faced, right? So we should use technology. We should use these global platforms.
Particularly in the gig economy.
Well, particularly in the gig economy, but actually in all work, in all sort of low-skill, low-wage work, right? Waiting 2 weeks is actually a terrible thing. The reason the payday loan industry operates is because you have to wait 2 weeks to get paid. Right. But technology can actually play a role in solving that problem. And I think what would be great is if we could get all the different groups that are trying to solve these problems around financial stability and economic security to work together on solving some of these problems.
Have the Ubers of the world and the Airbnbs pushed it too far on the sort of the reputation issue? That maybe they get back to this question of are you being listened to, that they won't be listened to when they try and solve the bigger problem, as Amit was just saying.
No, I think that the fact that companies like Uber, certainly like Postmates, are engaged in policy experiments means that it doesn't matter if everyone is paying attention to us right now, because a lot of this is data gathering. We're trying our level best in earnest to figure out whether our policy interventions will work, and then share that out with stakeholders and bring additional stakeholders around the table. So for example, one thing that we know for Postmates deliverers is that about 40% of our workers are actually looking for full-time work, and about 80% of them on the platform deliver for 20 hours a week or less, truly supplemental income. So just 2 weeks ago in San Francisco, we matriculated our first class of Postmates into a career pathways program called JVS. It uses US Department of Labor grants, and now they actually have access to various skills development curricula tailored and targeted for them. Now that for us is not that a declaration that Postmates is making a pivot as being an educational company, but what it is acknowledging that there are very real realities to the way workforce habits are playing out, and we are fueling that in part. So if we layer on top of that an experiment that has to do with upskilling in terms of educational certainty and using that as a ladder to opportunity, that is something that once we take that back and share it out, folks ought to listen to, because that's only one actor that is using the gig flexible model, layering on top of that an educational intervention, and those are very unique proprietary insights, and sharing it out in the world is most important. So it's less important to be heard for saying that, hey, pay attention, we are legitimate policy players at the table, and rather taking our ownership stake as being a cutting edge industry player that has a unique bully pulpit in which they can draw out these insights.
Subnational government, national government, who should be dealing with this issue?
I mean, some of the places where we're seeing the most innovation have been cities, and cities playing really a force of bringing people together and saying, you know, we need to do this, or experimenting with a new approach to something. So I think that's a place where we can have a little bit faster in effect than at the federal level right now.
What do you think is going to happen in New York with Uber, and indeed in London? TfL are clearly looking at their license. Is your new CEO, I'm really putting you on the spot with this one because I know he's here somewhere as well, but is your new CEO helping this process? Do you think it's a process that will work for Uber?
I think the most important thing is that when you move, when we started, and bearing in mind that a lot of these companies are less than a decade old, When we started as peer-to-peer connectors, right? And we've moved basically steadily through the chain into more responsible into platforms, and platforms have a certain responsibility in terms of how they operate. And I think the really key thing is to ensure that responsibility is a high responsibility, it's an important responsibility, and you've got to take it very seriously. And I think what's really important is that we work with different people. So the first thing is to partner with different stakeholders. You partner with cities, you partner with different groups, partner with labor groups, right? One of the first things that Dara did at the beginning of this year was he wrote a letter with the president of the SEIU in Washington State, and he wrote a letter to say that that we need to take tangible steps on portable benefits, right? And that's using, as Kristin was saying, sometimes actually the states and the cities are better places to actually try these things out. So, that's a sort of tangible step. I think the other thing that you've got to do is also take a stand. You know, you've got to stand for something positive in the world, right? And we make that very clear in terms of the way in which we think about work. We think that work is incredibly important to provide access to work, to ensure that people have flexibility in that work, that they're protected in that work, and that work leads to personal growth and opportunity. And I think the last thing is that standing for something is great, but you've actually got to deliver foundationally, right, and deliver transformation. And the thing that our new CEO announced with President Macron in May was an example of that, was delivering foundationally. And I think what's really significant is if you run a platform that has over 3 million people that get work from it, it's to ensure that you're thinking of innovative ways in which you can deliver social protection. One thing that is really impressive is that the fact that we now provide some form of social protection for injury at work in all of Europe, in India, in most parts of Africa, in all of LATAM, and we're thinking about this at a global level, and I think that's an important thing and something that he's led the charge on, and I think that's something we can work on.
I mean, are we going to get to a point, because I think what this is really about, employers valuing their employee as that brand ambassador. That needs to change, doesn't it? The way the worker is perceived by the employer. And if that doesn't change, then I can't see this going anywhere.
Well, I think Postmates as a company is named after our workers. Our fleet of deliverers are known internally as Postmates. So I think it starts with an internal ethos about making that prioritization. I think that also, you know, as Amit said, over the arc of the last year, particularly with new leadership at Uber, you see a concerted commentary publicly about investing in the worker. For us at Postmates, in 2017, for $220 million in earnings were taken home by our Postmates workers. On average, they make about $18.34 per hour. Certainly not the most glamorous wage, but significantly better than minimum wage in many jurisdictions. And we're actively trying to invest in route efficiencies that allow them to earn more in any given day. So when we talk about caring about the worker, we have to talk about it from like the first core principle of what the product is. And in this case, it's a chance for them to earn. I think the additional concepts of layering on top all of these different policy interventions are a clear declaration of the need and want to invest in this worker and their long-term growth.
Well, I mean, but it's the wording here that I don't get sometimes. Caring about the worker is one thing, but actually valuing the worker as a brand ambassador, someone who represents your business, is just the savvy thing to do, isn't it?
I mean, I think most large companies are, and particularly large companies that have a mix of traditional and non-traditional workers, are starting to think about that very specifically, because they're thinking about recruitment and retention as an ongoing long-term basis rather than a linear process where somebody gets a job and stays for the next 20 years. And so if that's the case, then I think that companies that started out with on-demand workforces will also start to think about, you know, how do you have a workforce that goes in and out of being part of your set of workers and then goes out and earns income from other sources, and how do you sort of make those things integrate with one another?
Could I tackle that a different way? I mean, I think it's also valuing the worker is important as a brand ambassador. The best way that you could do that is actually taking their input to heart and allowing that to implicate the product. So at Postmates, we actually have something called the Fleet Advisory Board, which we are recruiting workers, Postmates in different markets, top markets for us as an experiment to start, and getting their feedback, not just on some of the policy recommendations that we might advocate for on the legislative front, but also on the product recommendations. Do they feel that they have enough support when they're on the job? Do they feel that they have instant pay quickly enough? I think that is when you start, when the worker in the on-demand economy, who, as was already previously discussed, is not an employee and therefore treated very distinct from the rest of the company like a partner, and you start investing them as a partner and draw those insights into the company, then that changes the steer of how you value them down the road.
Look, time's running out. It goes extremely quickly when you've got 3 people on a panel. Let me get some final thoughts and just phrase the question this way. A year from now, if we're sitting on this stage, how different is this conversation going to be? Do you think it is going to be different a year from now?
I hope so. I hope this conversation is different a year from now. I hope this conversation has moved to working out ways in which we can actually solve the issue. That is, solve the issue where we put the needs of workers and put the needs of workers that work in very different ways first. I hope that a year from now we can actually talk about regulatory and institutional systems that actually accommodate these types of changes. I hope that a year from now we can think about the model that we've got in France and talk about multiple other types of models. I mean, models that accommodate the ability of platforms to be able to provide economic security through benefits, through looking at ways in which you can invest in people's future, invest in people's skills. Also to provide ways in which you can provide rights of recourse and ways in which they can actually exercise their voice. So yes.
That's your hope. Are you confident it's going to happen?
I'm confident that we will have that have that progress in some markets. And I think the reason why we'll have to do that is because people are getting left behind. Right? And it's not a viable situation for anybody. Right? At the moment, the binary simplistic way in which we have constructed our perceptions around the social contract are not helping anybody. They don't help workers, they don't help businesses, they don't help governments, and they actually don't help democracy in general. And I think that thing will actually force an impetus for us to act.
Do you think policy and society are going to get that argument, Amit's argument, a year from now?
I think a year from now, in order for that to get it, 3 things need to happen. 1, we need to know about who we're talking about. It wasn't until this year that since 2005, the US government released a data set about contingent work and alternate work arrangements. Even that data set didn't include questions about on-demand workers that use apps. So I would argue that we need Congress to fund annually or semi-regularly some crisp federal authoritative insight as to what this landscape is. Number 2, I think what we need to do is have way more education of lawmakers. A lot of lawmakers that were elected into office now in multiple markets aren't entirely aware of how workers use these platforms to operate. They aren't entirely aware about this notion of worker flexibility. And as Kristin pointed out, they have these perceptions of what the dignity of work means versus the dignity of a job. And since America has this special imagination of that concept of you work hard, you do the right thing, you put food on the table, and then you leave your next generation a little better off, thinking about that in a very different way of doing work is something that we as industry must socialize with policymakers. And then the third and final thing that needs to play out, as I mentioned earlier at the top, is that industry must continue to work with worker advocacy organizations, because I think the binary Amit speaks to is only going to be inflamed with political tensions, not substantive tensions, political tensions, unless we actually come to the table and trade notes about how we bridge workers with worker protections and worker flexibility.
Sorry, Kristin, I just want to follow up very quickly on the education piece, your second point. Do you really see that happening in the next few years, or are we going to have to wait for a whole new generation of politicians, elected politicians, before we see that sort of education that we need?
First things first, not to sound silly here, but we've got a midterm election coming up in a couple of weeks here, and I think that it starts there, right? It starts by turning out and voting for candidates that you feel like can understand this. But no, I do think the onus is on us, and as Amit said, all of us, to show up and knock on the doors of these lawmakers at all levels. Because if cities and subnational engagement is going to continue to be where we experiment, then we're not just talking about members of Congress, God bless them. We're talking about state electeds, we're talking about mayors, we're talking about working with the National Governors Association and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And I think that must happen, otherwise they will continue to be able to rest on the laurel of a lack of political will, because we aren't goosing them along with that education.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So quickly, I can do this quickly.
No, you can go a little over.
So I think we need to expand the conversation in 2 ways, one of which we've already talked about, and that's expand our definition of what economic stability is. The second thing, which we haven't really talked about today, is think about new ways give workers voice and to aggregate worker interests. One of the things that comes up over and over again in the gig economy is that it's very hard in a situation where there's a ratio of one person to one employing person. It's not a big company that employs 30,000 people in mass anymore. It's like, particularly in the on-demand world and in the care industry, like you're talking about one person working for one person and figuring out ways to identify what the needs are and then allow workers to advocate collectively for those needs is something that we just haven't adapted our systems to yet and need to do. So I hope that the conversation continues to adapt those things as we go forward too.
All right. Look, it's been a fascinating conversation. Apologies that my back's to everyone in this part of the room. Thank you very much indeed to our panel. Thank you.